Jacksonville, a child was born who couldn't sit still. 86 years later with no regret. You know that man can't sit still yet. The Great Depression couldn't get him down. He worked for his dad's store in town, collecting money in small amounts for poor whites and blacks in their furniture accounts. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. As he'd collect, he'd talk to folks. He'd hear legends, tales, songs, and jokes. Now this fine treasure he'd record and write. He was colorblind, didn't see black and white. Writer's project for the WPA. Zora Neale Hurston, he earned his pay. Crackers and blacks, they talk for hours. It was a barefoot history in this land of flowers.
The Weekman was on the 2nd of June 2018 from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. We also would thank our theme creators, the Stetson Kennedy Foundation, and you'll see the link down there to the foundation, and we're appreciative of the work that they do down in Florida. We have Uncle Carl Rove here before we finish, but we'll start in the city of St. Louis, and by a product of the state of Missouri. Missouri is a prime example of the right-wing emergence of DJ Trump. And we'll have a study here that bows out the resentment factor by Europeans in that election. Now, the election of DJ Trump in 2016 was a low turnout election. Number of factors, of course, factored in there. The enormous amount of voter suppression in states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, a long list of states. And in some states, a low turnout. And you also add in there political malpractice on the part of Hillary DeMoster Clinton and her general campaign staff in terms of the issues. And it also went back into the primary when Bernie Sanders of Vermont was running for president and was robbed by agents of Hillary DeMoster Clinton. These resentments carried on. Many of those voters that voted for Bernie are the same voters that voted for Barack Obama, and also by extension voted for DJ Trump. That's where it gets a little bit confused there, but it takes many people to make a victorious election. But the overall themes in 2016 were the same as in 1968. In essence, the law and order campaign by DJ Trump. In those days, Nixon had busing, he had rebellions in various cities. DJ Trump had Black Lives Matter and various other things. The social safety net, and we'll be talking about that. That's where the resentment vote comes in. And the Republicans are now utilizing that to cut Medicaid. And in many states, they went to work on that particular situation. That's the so-called social safety net. The idea around that is that people of color, particularly African Americans, as a large grouping there, benefit from those programs, and they also bring in immigrants, Latinos, etc., as benefiting from those programs that provide health care, food sufficiency, etc., and housing. So if you cut those programs back, you save billions of dollars. No doubt about that. That is not an argumentable situation. However, though, in terms of health care, you actually exacerbate the problem, because people will get sicker and sicker, and they will end up in medical centers, in ERs, and admitted to hospitals before they literally die. And we have a little story from Bloomberg about what happened in Puerto Rico. We now understand the manifestations of this new version of Dr. Monahan and his benign neglect. But this is not benign neglect. This is just plain neglect. And this is where we go. We'll go to Eric Gittins. He was the poster boy, the governor of Missouri, who resigned in disgrace on a Friday. He went in as a family values man. He had been, a naval SEAL. The types of stuff that you generate when you are running a program of nativism and national chauvinism, and that's basically what he ran in Missouri. Let's just get this. Is from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. The new governor there in Missouri, Mike Parsons, pledges a fresh start. Of course, he's sworn in as a governor. Swept into office amidst a historic scandal. Pearson, a farmer and former sheriff with a wealth of capital experience, called for a fresh start Friday as he was formally installed as the 57th governor of Missouri. Service is a privilege. He was a former lieutenant governor, being sworn in by the Supreme Court Justice Mary Russell, pledged to bring honor, integrity, and transparency to an office that's been under a clout. His predecessor left office at 5 o'clock on a Friday. In other words, he was out of the office before literally sundown. In a one-line letter submitted Friday, Glidden, before leaving, Glidden took action on 77 bills sent to him by the House and Senate. Among the bills approved, a cut in the corporate income tax, new rules how utility rates for companies such as Amera are regulated. In addition, he pardoned 5 people. This is Glidden, I guess, in the great tradition of DJ Trump. Glidden left his political future in tatters and was greeted by lawsuits in ruling in Cole County, that is by Beaton. Glidden and his employees were ordered to submit a list of phone numbers, names, and phone models of anyone in the governor's office who used an application called Confine, which destroys text messages immediately after they are read. So in other words, the plot thickened on Glidden. The moving van pulled up at 1 o'clock. Glidden's staff hauled boxes and other personal items out of suites of office on the second floor to make room for Parsons to move in, who is now the governor. We are in the planning stage. We're in the transition part, he told reporters. This is Parsons. And they were making the move out of there. Among the top tasks facing him when return to work will include finding workers to replace those who left with Glidden. He also must remake the state school board, which has not met since January because of outgoing squabbles there between the legislature and Glidden's. And the Confine lawsuit, which was filed by the Sunshine Project, focuses on whether the app violated the state laws there. So there's big problems there, period. And Parsons became sheriff of Polk County the same week as he became president, I didn't know this, of the Southwest Baptist University in Bovera in 1993. That's according to Roy Blunt. So they're hailing this fella as having all kinds of integrity and a fresh start in the state of Missouri as far as some priorities there. Let's see what he pardoned here. Glittens. He pardoned Stacy A. Lanner, Judy Henderson. I won't go into these because I don't know their names anyway. Wiping their slates clean, and he commuted sentences of Rodney Lincoln, Elvis J. Williams, etc. Glidden said Lincoln and McKim were wrongfully convicted of murder, and Miller, 75, was serving time for murder she did not commit or participate in. Williams in Kansas City was serving an 80-year sentence from 1994 for stealing electronics. And that would now result in a maximum sentence of only 10 years in prison. Lanier is now a public defender in St. Louis, but spent more than 18 years in a prison for fatally shooting her father in a St. Louis home in 1990. Lanier was a victim of constant rape, etc. Rodney Lincoln commuted 2 life sentences for Lincoln here, was convicted of a 1982 murder in St. Louis, and the court had last denied Lincoln's request to read. This is Missouri State Supreme Court, and it was taken up by the Midwest Innocence Project. Lincoln is 73 and has been serving time in the Jefferson City Correction Institute. Proclaimed his innocence. In his last appeal, he cited recantation of a testimony of one of Tate's daughters and questions about a hair analysis there. And let's see, Stacy Lanert, just as how you pronounce that, sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole, had been commuted to 20 years in 2009 by then Governor Matt Blunt. As he was leaving office, Blunt said she was sexually abused. The commentation allowed her to leave prison weeks later. Lanier told the St. Louis Dispatch that she regrets the crime, but though at the time it was the only way to end the abuse. Three prior governors rejected that. Lemieux, then 18, fatally shot her father, and while he was asleep on a couch. The psychologist testified Lanier couldn't control her actions, but the jury rejected that. Jurors were told not to consider any abuse and mitigating factors. The sister, Chastity Lemieux, pleaded guilty conspiracy anyway, after admitting she and her sister raised $5,000 to kill their father. After the commentation, the St. Louis County prosecuting attorney, this Robert McClintock, insisted that greed motivated the crime and called Blunt's action cowardly for letting a killer go out. He was in the Michael Brown case and refused to indict the murder of Michael Brown. And Judy Henderson was sentenced to life in prison for her role in the killing of another person. It's in Springfield, Missouri. Commuted her sentence in December. to time served after she spent 35 years in prison. That's a very, very long time. In many countries, that's 25 years. So those are the people he commuted and did commentations for there. So suppose Glitton's leaves with less clouds over him than at one time. But nonetheless, he is out. Parsons is in. And that is in the state of Missouri. And the Kansas City Star, here, this is an older article from the Kansas City Star. And basically about the same thing. Times Missouri to come together. This is Mike Parsons is sworn in as the new governor in the state of Missouri. And let's see what else we have here. Okay, we'll leave it at this juncture. We'll skip to the Washington Post here. And as we sort of skip around a bit, and we'll probably refer back to this study a number of times, but it's a recent study. Status threat, not economic hardships, explains the 2016 election. This is from the Department of Political Science, University of Pennsylvania, and the Annenberg School for Communications there. And this is Jennifer A. Richardson of Yale in New Haven, Connecticut, and Diane Muntz. The study evaluates evidence pertaining to the popular narrative explaining the American public support for DJ Trump in the 2016 election, first using unique representative probability samples of the American public and tracking the same individuals from 2012 to 2016. I examined the left behind this thesis. This thesis, that is, the thesis that those who lost jobs experienced stagnant wages due to loss of manufacturing jobs punished the incumbent party of their economic misfortunes. Secondly, I considered the possibility that status threat felt by a dwindling proportion of traditional high-status Americans, i.e. Europeans, Christians, and men, as well as those who perceive America's global dominance as a threat, combined to increase support for candidates who emphasize reestablishing status hierarchies of the past. Results did not support an interpretation of election based on pocketbook economic considerations. Instead, the short relative distance of people own views from the Republican candidates on trade and corresponding to greater support of a DJ Trump relative to Willard Romney, and that was in 2016. 2012, Canada's preference in 2016 reflects increased anxiety among what they call high status groups, rather than a growing domestic racial diversity and globalization contribute to a sense that European America, what she calls white America, under siege by these engines of change. Now, we won't go through the entire study here, but there are, while people have spoken, it's critical to understand what it is, and they have said needlessly, even in high-stakes profile American presidential election, this important task typically is left to journalists and pundits who are unlikely to have the identical tools or adequate data to address the question. Because elections are not amenable to experimentation, it's difficult for scholars to find strong causal claims. As a result, most interpretation of elections outcomes either rely on cross-selection associated in survey data or inferences from aggregated data on voting patterns, by geographical area. Neither approach is the best that can be done. In an observational setting, panel data is a wise data are widely acknowledged as the ideal basis for causal conclusions. When analyzed appropriately, they have the ability to eliminate most potentially specious associations. Surprisingly, there are few panels available to examine most election outcomes. The major data collection pertaining to elections are cross-sectioned in design. However, for the two most recent presidential elections, a large representative probability sample of the American public was interviewed in 2012 and again in 2007, shortly after the victory of DJ Trump. To date, the dominant narrative explaining the outcome of the 2016 election has been that the working class rose up in opposition to the left-behind economy. Those who lost jobs explain stagnation, purportedly punished. Let me just see. I gotta go up here. Punished incumbent party. Those claims were made, based on aggregated demographic patterns tied to voter education levels. And we've always railed against that and patterns that could occur for multiple reasons. This study evaluates the left-behind thesis as well as a dominant group, a status threat as an alternative narrative explaining Trump's popular appeal and ultimate election to the presidency. Evidence points overwhelmingly to perceived status threat amongst high status groups as a key motivation underlying support. Europeans, Americans declining numerical dominance in the U.S. together with the rising status of African Americans and American insecurity about whether the U.S. is still the dominant global economic superpower, combined to prompt a classic defensive reaction amongst members of the dominant group. And we'll be referring back to this study for quite some time. Thus far, from limited studies of 2016, has been noted a popular belief among political scientists that campaigns do not change public opinion so much as active or prime certain considerations over others. In other words, by making some issues more salient than others, and campaigns increase the extent to which the peculiar issues opinions are used by voters when choosing a candidate. As recent studies analyzing preferences frame the question, which factors became more strong or weakly associated with people's choice in 2016 compared to 2012. Well, the media has to take some responsibility in it, no doubt about that, as is it. We're going to leave this now. The study used individual issues, attitude measurements in 2011 to predict the presidential preferences in 2012 and 2016, and motivation for using 2011 attitudes is said to be eliminating concerns regarding indigency, that is a possibility that people change their attitudes to match the candidate's preference. Okay. However, the methodology concurs that the lag identification is almost never a solution to indigeneity problems in observational data. We're going to have to come back to this, but basically some of the same types of data out here, the spillover race and racial attitudes in the public opinion, even about climate change. This is from the National Election Survey and the Pew People. Results show that racial identity has become a significant predictor of a climate concern following the election of Barack Obama in 2012. Let's go back to a Washington Post. Well, no, this is actually a Washington Post article. Why European American racial resentment is a real impetus for cuts in the safety net. We talked about it as we came in. That's Medicaid and various other items. And this is from Welts, excuse me. And this is Stanford University and Rob Wilder. And his conclusions there. European Americans call for deep cuts. And this is not new. This is going back to 1968. And the Republicans have been talking about this. Reagan talked about welfare queens, etc. in his 1980 campaign. So in other words, this is not really new. What is new is the loss in status of a particular people, what we call it white privilege. And that will be bored out a little bit more when we get to it. And it takes on some things that have been talked about, but they really don't give the answers. Now, this is from Kaiser, shows that European Americans make up 36% of food stamp recipients and 43% of Medicaid recipients and 28% of recipients for cash, so-called payments. Now, it's a fairly large number there, and of course then you get in other groups that get some of the payments. I think welfare work requirements, Republicans say they are experts. This is a think tank, and we've talked about, economists call it junk science, an obscure Florida-based policy group tied to Paul Ryan. There's a lady talking about Paul Ryan today. Two of the country's most conservative Republican governors have been one of the loudest and most persuasive voices in debate over new work requirements. Now, this is LePage, the Foundation for Government Accountability, spent 6 years testing welfare change in Kansas, Mississippi, and other states before taking the idea to Washington. The government accountability leveraging of political connections and policy liners to become a fixture in Republican strategy. This is where a no-name foundation can literally come in. The work requirements issued Friday would fundamentally change the food sufficiency or food stamp program for adult recipients. Under the plan, most able-bodied people between 18 and 60 would work a 10 training program for 20 hours a week to receive benefits. House Republicans, including Ryan, who was introduced to the group in 2016 via the defeated Governor Sam Brownback. That was in Kansas. But unlike the old guard, with its low national program, remote staff of 26 and annual donated $7 million. Now devotes itself to a state policy. This is this group we're talking about in Florida. And with basically a litany of junk science. And these are conservatives from Texas, and there the FGA developed state models. And this is where we go up against, we talked about that last night on Friday Java, the old maximum of the former Speaker Thomas P. Tip O'Neill, that all politics are local. What these Republican think tanks have done, the Koch brothers, etc., they put together national models. And those models are introduced into state legislatures, making national policy and not a local policy. This example would be these work requirements. And they call it the HOPE Act. They always have very fancy names for things, and there's very little hope in the act, no doubt about that. The Kansas Study House Republicans have distributed another analysis of 3-year-old Department of Agriculture data that breaks down the number of unemployed, able-bodied food sufficiency recipients by state. The Washington Post reviewed the most USDA data suggests that the current figures on food stamp recipients are lower than the claim by this foundation. Well, this foundation could basically claim anything and put it out there, and people really don't address the facts. This is one reason that progressives need to do their own independent analysis of government data, big data, have you. And they are making it much, much harder now to attain it. So in other words, if you have an opportunity to scrub, as we call, download the data, do in fact do it as quickly as possible and often as you can, because it is essential in combating this nuttery out there. And there's a lot of nuttery out there, the so-called Freedom Caucus and various other nuts. But there's a lot of different genres out here. Let me just get one other thing. Revisiting Dr. George Tiller, the legacy in the Trump era. Legislators mount political attacks on reproductive health service. Dr. Tiller was killed 9 years ago on the 31st of May in Wichita, Kansas. He was at church at the time, and he ran what was termed an abortion clinic. For those who recall the history, of that bloody battle out in Wichita, Kansas, the federal judge had to deploy U.S. Marshals into Wichita. It was that bad with the right to life. People, period. And including recently released Shannon. This is Shirley Shannon, who shot Dr. Tiller in both arms. This is in 1993. Scott Reedus, who spent years on the fringe of the anti-abortion extremism, was another one of them. Frustrated by Dr. Tiller, had once again been exonerated, of course, of bogus charges there. This has been to whip up the sentiment. This is another part of the attack here. So things like clinic disruptions, the number of trespass incidents in clinics more than tripled from 247 in 2016 to 823. This is empowerment of these criminal forces, blockades and what have you there. And they do mention the because of a 1994 federal freedom of access to clinic entries. Last year there were 104 clinic blockades around the country. People, Operation Rescue was the nuts, but these nuts are using these emotional issues to literally hype up the crowd of criminals. That is what they are meant to. This is Rewired News, incidentally, going a little over, over the place, but looking at status threats, and what we should say is, finish up this study by Diane Mutz, that in effect what you are hearing here is a lot of perceived loss. They're talking about basically within 50 years of it. Now, the Left Behind thesis fits more squarely within the rational choice of pocketbook theoretical camp, arguing that voters reward the party that has benefited them financially and punish the party that does not. This is easily accessible information about one's financial well-being was assumed basic for the referendum on the party in office, consistent with the theme. The Rust Belt of the Northeast and Midwest played an unexpected role. We're talking here about Ohio and Pennsylvania. But if you remember, those states, particularly Pennsylvania, went back to, we covered Barack Obama from the old State House in Springfield, Missouri. And the Pennsylvania primary, he lost to Hillary Clinton upon the same thing, racism, to keep the African American out of the White House. That was the theme there. Now, he later won Pennsylvania in the national election, but that was a different type of situation. And also recall that the narrow loss in the state of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, etc. Let me just switch gears here. Dick Tuck. He was a Democratic political prankster. Died this week at 94. Dick Tuck, the Democratic prankster at large from the New York Times, who bedeviled Barry Goldwater, Tricky Dicky Nixon, and other Republicans with bad news fortune cookies and other things. Died in Phoenix on Monday at 94. He was in an assisted living facility. He retired as a Democratic National Consultant, Strategist, and Advancement. Tuck was a king of gremlin political shenanigans, starting in California in the 50s, needling GOP rivals for decades, dogged by Mr. Tuck. Most of his political life, Nixon can be overheard on the tapes. Tuck exploited his own team's crude and illegal dirty tricks. Nixon was an admirer of mine, Mr. Tuck said in a phone interview for his obituary in 2013 from his home in Tucson. With unconcealed glee, he recalls many pranks and quoted Nixon on the tapes as saying Tuck did that and got away with it, and shows you what a master Dick Tuck was. On the morning after the first televised presidential debate, that's between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy in 1960, Tuck enlisted an elderly woman to saddle up to Nixon in Memphis, Tennessee, wearing a big Nixon button. She hugged him and cuddled as TV cameras rolled. That's right, son. Kennedy beat you last night, but don't worry, you'll get him next time. Those are the kinds of good-hearted tricks he did. Another trick here, Democratic officials usually disavowed his activities, and Republicans nearly always disputed the claims. Another scheme he had, he shot and leapfrogged Republican campaigns, planted agents with surprises at whistle stops, disrupted schedules, started nasty rumors, issued bogus press advisors, those kinds of things. Anyway, placards, let's see. Tuck's operatives were around, and buses pulled up early. Trains made on scheduled stops, placards in foreign language bore messages and letters. Newsletters hailed Democrats at Republican rallies. Bands struck up "Happy Days Are Here Again." That was a theme song of FDR. And Lyndon Johnson balloons floated up, and fire chiefs have. At least those wore fire chief hats underestimated the size of the crowd. I mean, this was very creative, dirty tricks. He executed no break-ins, illegal wiretaps, money laundering, or felonious cover-ups of the kind that drove Nixon from office. While the seriousness of political sabotage is open to interpretation, one's dirty tricks is usually another's clever tactics. Mr. Tuck insisted that his own stunts were benign mischief, being hoodwinking Nixon, the student at the University of California, Santa Barbara. That was in 1950, while secretly backing Helen Hagen Douglas for the Senate. He volunteered to work for the Republicans and made arrangements for a Nixon rally. And I'll finish it up now. He hired an auditorium seating 2,000 people, but neglected to publicize the event. Only 20 people showed up, and Nixon arrived. And Tuck made a long-winded introduction and asked the candidate to speak on international monetary policy. In 1958, when Pat Brown ran for governor, Tuck delivered a special treat at a Republican banquet given by Chinese supporters of his opponent, Senator Nolan. Fortune cookies with the message, Nolan for premier of Formosa. In 1962, Pat Brown ran for re-election against Nixon, who, and this is when he lost. He arranged a stinger at a Nixon rally in Los Angeles, Chinatown. In the Chinatown caper, Tuck recalls a sign saying "Welcome Nixon." Also asked in Chinese, "What about the huge loan?" referring to an unsecured $205,000 loan by Howard Hughes' brother, to Tricky Dicky, I think it was, and various other things there. That he did the Goldwater and so forth and so on. He was born, I didn't know this, in Hayden, Arizona. This is Mr. Tuck. His father managed mines for the Kennecott copper place. He attended a school in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, and San Jose, California. He joined the Marines in World War II, disarmed bombs in the South Pacific, and etc., etc. He studied political science at Santa Barbara, as it said earlier there. And what else? Oh, he was a press aide to Robert F. Kennedy, and evidently to Hubert Humphrey. He worked for George McGovern. I didn't know that, the South Dakota Democrat who was trounced by Nixon. Dick Tuck did that to me, Nixon said on a 1972 recording returned to one of the times Tuck embarrassed him. Let's get out what Dick Tuck did. And that's something where we can go. We'll go to Uncle Carl Robe here. We run a little over time, but we'll get this hopefully done, or we'll have to put Uncle Carl someplace else. I thought we had Uncle Carl. We don't want to forget Uncle Carl. Here we go. Uncle Carl's writing in the Wall Street Journal, as usually did, on the 31st of May. Trump should play the long game on trade. A pledge by China to reduce its trade surplus with the U.S. is difficult to enforce and easy to discard. Its districts from underlining problems in the U.S. trade relation with China, while giving the Chinese more time to dominate the technologies of the future, rather than short-term tweets to balance the trades. The administration to seek long-term policies that level the playing field and strengthen the rule of what Uncle Carl cites as the rule of law. The U.S. should insist on an end to China's trade-related investment measures to pressure foreign companies into transferring intellectual property to Chinese partners. Second, the U.S. should demand the elimination of limits on foreign ownership of Chinese companies. Well, there are limits in the U.S. on ownership of companies, and some the Chinese are not permitted to own at all. Prohibit presses like there are routinely including trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the European Free Trade Agreement, work with allies. The U.S. can and should extend those to China. Mistake. Finally, the U.S. must pass both the bilateral negotiation with China and the World Trade Organization to end China's trade distortioning subsidies to state-owning enterprise. Well, that's just part of the Chinese economic system. China has been clear about its desire to dominate key technologies. We talked about that before. By 2025. Long-term economic, military, and strategical significance, the made in China. And he does talk about it. 225 targets include artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced silicon. G5, very important, the Internet of Things, robotics, and electronic vehicles. Those are the same things that American and European companies also want to dominate and are trying to dominate. Unfortunately, U.S. research money has been cut. China's key companies with provide with low-cost capital. The U.S. does too. Then an unfair advantage over non-Chinese enterprises, especially in sales to what he calls the third world. Well, the big problem is American and European companies have not been interested basically in the third world because they have little money. But the Chinese have been able to leverage quote-unquote natural resources, especially emerging countries like Ghana, Kenya, etc., and at the same time build infrastructure that is very important in those countries for many years to come, like the railroads that are in Kenya. Those not only serve the Chinese have to get their products from the rural areas to places where they can be hauled to ports and effectively back to China. So those are some of the things coming on. While China aims to command the industries of the future, the Trump administration is pursuing trade policies to reclaim America's share of the last century's economies by fixating, and this is part of what we came in trying to connect this up, on goods like steel, aluminum, germanium, internal combustion cars. While imported, these industries employ an ever declining number of Americans and generate a diminished share of gross domestic product, GDP. Instead of trying to protect these industries by taxing American businesses and consumers with high tariffs. And this is one of the things that's happening here with the tariffs. The tariffs themselves are seen by many economists as a tax within itself. But under the regime that DJ Trump has, the digital economy, data analytics, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and other likely drivers of 21st economic growth. Those are hard to safeguard when your basic research of your country itself has suffered for many years. In very large states, California, Texas, etc., the budgets for education, whether it be higher or secondary, have been cut for 20 years. And that you come up against. And if you look at just simple figures out of places like Silicon Valley, almost 80% of the data workers there, scientists, etc., architects, developers, come from outside of North America. So in other words, you're just importing intellectual property workers into the country. So when you talk about America first, this is the whole idea behind Dr. Mitt's study of the threat that people see of their cultural identity. Well, it's already here. And this is why the idea of focus on immigration, but that's the lower part of immigration. People coming across the border, not people flying in aeroplanes into the country and what have you. So the whole, I'll sum this up, the whole idea of the Trump administration is America First. They're talking about lower sectors primarily of the economy, mining, steel factories, where they employ, say, 500 additional workers. But at the same time, the retail sector is collapsing, and we have Toys R Us, 30,000 workers there, with no pension benefits. Because of the way the law was written, the executives got bonuses. Let's pause very quickly here to get to sports. We'll return in a minute. As many people are aware now, the Golden State Warriors won the first game of the NBA Finals over the Cleveland Cavaliers. So we'll go to Game 2. In the National Hockey League, they have moved now to the capital, the Golden Knights of Las Vegas, and the Caps. The series is tied 1-1. Let's go to baseball here. The Yankees were in Camden Yards. Yankees 4-1. This is on a Friday, the 1st of June. The Blue Jays were in the Motor City. Tigers at 5-1. The Cubbies were in New York. Cubbies won the game 7-4. The Nationals were in Atlanta, and they were shut out by Atlanta 4-0. The Brewers were on the south side of Chicago. White Sox 8-1. Cleveland was in the Twin Cities, Twins 7-4. The Red Sox were in Houston, Astros 7-3. The Athletics were in Kansas City, and shout out to Royal slugfest on the part of the Athletics, 16-0. The line score, the Athletics had 6 hits, and Kansas City had 8 hits. There were no errors on both teams. The Pirates were in St. Louis and shut out the Cards 4-0. The Dodgers were in the Mile High City, a game that we tuned into. The final score was 11-8. It was a slugfest. Had a line score. Dodgers had 8 hits and no errors, and the Rockies 13 hits and no errors. And that will continue through the weekend. Mr. Jansen was the winner. And let's see, where else are we? Oops. The Marlins and D-backs in Arizona, Diamondbacks at 9-1. The Rangers and Angels in California, and the Angels shut out the Rangers 6-0. And in 12, the Rays were in Seattle. The game ended up 4-3 Mariners. The Reds and Padres. The Reds were all over the Padres 7-2. And finally, the Phillies have moved on from L.A. to San Francisco. Giants are 4-0 in that contest. So that is sports, and this is the week that was on the 2nd of June 2018. Hopefully we connected up some of the dots, and we'll continue on that study. It takes a little while to bring all that together. What was the real motivation? A loss of status in the 2016 election, as opposed to, and it was really these groups of threat with Hillary Clinton, a little different type of threat than with the Barack Obama administrations and the re-election, a more bourgeois type candidate was Hillary Clinton, and the perception of where things are going, particularly for women. Now, I don't know if this study mentions that or not, but that was evidently some of the alarm bells that brought additional people out in some of the districts. But when we look at the whole election portfolio, roughly about 80,000 votes. Now, that was out of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Ohio was never in dispute, the 3 states. But again, that is not a lot of votes out of millions of votes that were carried. And in Wisconsin, you had a lot of voter suppression. Also in Michigan, and a lot of voter apathy. So when you add all of those together, and it happened in Pennsylvania also. Have a good weekend, everyone. We'll talk to you on the Monday morning quarterback as I run out of my water here. I have to reach to it. And on the Monday Morning Quarterback, as I said, we'll be quarterbacking the talk shows if there are any of interest there. Sometimes we'll continue with the study by Dr. Metz. I believe that's Mutz. And we will also highlight a few other things. So we'll just continue with the themes, and we'll have special programming, I believe, on Monday or perhaps on Sunday. The California primary. California used to be very important back to the days of Robert F. Kennedy, who was killed after winning the primary in California. And it became not so prominent because on June the 5th, off-year elections and in the presidential elections. But this time around is very important because a number of Republican House seats are up there, and the Democrats are playing a high-stakes game. So we'll look at it, and we'll be back with the poll there, the study, excuse me. So what we're trying to do here is blend both the academic in with the practical, and also the various political models and handicappers, bringing all this in, bringing in the world of polling to the way the study is looked at. And hopefully as we move along, we'll explain these a little bit better. We have Numbers Man coming up, and incidentally, DJ Trump put out more or less the job numbers that are embargoed. He didn't mention the specifics, but it was a break in quote-unquote what is a tradition. So we'll talk about that, political story to an economic story, and we also have an open source report. So we have a lot of work here to do at WBGT. And on the Boston Red Network, I am running out of gas after 55 minutes here of this broadcast. Good day.